My girlfriend Dana's car seemed to break down every 2 weeks, and right on cue, her old friend Thomas, the mechanic, was always the first one on the scene. Not just sometimes. Every single time. At first, I brushed it off as coincidence, but then the pattern got too neat. He'd show up like some sort of roadside superhero, ready to tow her car straight to his shop for another suspiciously free fix. And the part that ate at me most? No one but me seemed to question it. Eventually, though, I followed him, and that's when I got the proof. When coincidence turns into a schedule. It started with what looked like bad luck, but the timing was the thing that refused to sit right with me. Dana's car didn't break down randomly the way you'd expect, once after a long trip, or maybe during a cold snap in winter. No, hers failed with an eerie regularity, almost like it had an internal timer set to explode every 2 weeks. I watched it happen. The alternator one time, the brakes a couple weeks later, then the starter not long after that. Battery, transmission, back to brakes. It rotated through disasters like it had a checklist. What really got under my skin was that the schedule never drifted. 14 days. If the last breakdown hit on a Friday afternoon, the next would land right on another Friday, often within the same hour. I could actually predict her car's failures more accurately than I remembered my own deadlines. After the third time, I even started writing them on my phone calendar, half as a joke, half as a sanity check. Car fails again got penciled in every other week, and each reminder turned out to be dead on. Normal car trouble doesn't stick to a timetable. Things wear out, sure, but they do it messily and unpredictably. A starter dies after thousands of cranks. Brake pads fade over months of use. Batteries weaken slowly until one day they won't turn over the engine. But none of that happens in precision 2-week intervals. These breakdowns were behaving with more consistency than actual maintenance schedules. It felt less like a failing car and more like someone staging little shows on repeat. Dana, on the other hand, sighed as nothing more than inconvenience piled on bad fortune. She'd throw her hands up, complain about the headache of getting stranded again, and then move on with her day once Thomas swooped in to fix it. I'd sit there biting my tongue because luck doesn't punch a clock that reliably. Nobody gets an alternator failure exactly 14 days after a dead battery, followed 2 weeks later by brakes going soft again. That wasn't luck. It was rhythm. After a while, I stopped being surprised and started waiting it out like an exam scoring day. I'd wake up on one of those Fridays and feel my stomach sink. I didn't wonder if the car would fail. I wondered when. The call or text always came by late afternoon. The engine wouldn't turn over, or the brake pedal felt wrong, or the transmission had just quit mid-drive. I'd listen, nod, already knowing it was time again. Dana never clocked the precision. To her, it was just bad brakes hitting over and over, each one separate from the last. But to me, it was impossible to miss the metronome keeping time. 2 weeks, 2 weeks, 2 weeks. Nobody I told seemed to believe me either. Friends brushed it off as me overthinking, like I was stretching coincidences until they clicked into a pattern in my head. But if you could have seen the notes I kept with dates marked down like evidence, you'd understand why it felt more like proof than paranoia. The system we were living under made everything harder. Any plan Dana and I made had a 50% chance of collapsing into a repair day. Even when we still managed to meet up, her mind was often split between where we were and her car sitting in a garage again. It turned her car into an anchor, and not in the sense that it kept her grounded. It dragged us back every other week like a chain on her schedule. After enough cycles, I couldn't shake the thought, if randomness wasn't responsible, then someone else was. That question echoed louder with every entry in my notes. Who benefits from this exact rhythm? Who shows up every single time, right on cue? My phone calendar was just one form of tracking, but soon I'd start noticing more than just the timing. Little physical details would catch my eye that suggested this wasn't coincidence at all. And that's when I also couldn't ignore the other constant. Because every time Dana's car failed, one person arrived almost instantly like he'd been waiting for the signal. Thomas, the tow truck superhero. Thomas turned these moments into something more than simple repairs. He arrived with such predictable speed and precision that it felt rehearsed, as if he were a performer stepping onto stage right on cue. Dana's car would fail, and minutes later he was standing there already dressed for the role. Gloves on, headlights strapped, rag tucked into his back pocket. He didn't look like a guy responding to an emergency, but more like someone waiting behind the curtain, ready to make his entrance. The way he handled each scene wasn't just about fixing a car. He narrated the moment. He'd say things like catastrophic failure or total collapse in a tone that made the problem sound apocalyptic. Nothing about his choice of words was casual. He leaned under the hood, took deep, theatrical breaths, and rattled off phrases as if he were reading lines from a script. My eyes would shift between him and Dana, and it stung seeing how captivated she looked by this exaggerated performance. Then there were the tools. Every time he arrived, he had whatever exact part or tool the problem supposedly required. If the alternator was out, he already had one. If the brakes were soft, he was squeezing the right hydraulic lines before I could even ask questions. It didn't add up. Nobody carries a traveling auto parts store in their truck unless they already know what to expect. For me, the way he appeared equipped was the biggest tell that this wasn't luck. It was theater disguised as preparation. That performance left me standing off to the side, useless. If I even reached toward the car, Thomas would block me verbally, saying, "Don't worry, man, I got it." And then he went right back to his spotlight act. He would tighten bolts with extra strain, wipe sweat across his forehead in slow motion, and slam the hood down with the seriousness of a surgeon finishing an operation. Each exit was punctuated by the slam of toolboxes and the roar of his truck, as if he wanted the whole block to hear his act of heroics. Dana treated him like the savior he clearly wanted to be. She smiled, thanked him, and praised his dependability. To her, it was relief. To me, it was a sideshow I couldn't opt out of. The more these rescues stacked up, the more I felt reduced to little more than background. Just another extra in a performance that starred Thomas and his carefully staged rescues. Every gesture from him and every look from her underscored that I wasn't needed. And I wasn't the only one who noticed how overblown it all felt. His girlfriend, Brenda, eventually began expressing concerns about his constant disappearances. I didn't know her well, but I heard through mutual friends that she confronted him over spending more time playing hero with Dana than being present in his own relationship. That detail made me realize this wasn't just a triangle where I was pushed aside. It was bigger, creating friction somewhere else too. And it raised an even sharper question. If even his girlfriend saw the act for what it was, why was Dana still blind to it? Still, trying to laugh it off was sometimes my only tool for dealing with the absurdity. I catch myself imagining Thomas in some ridiculous comic book costume, cape trailing behind him, sockets glowing like gadgets, booming out "Never Fear" while grease smeared across his cheek like warrior paint. Those mental pictures gave me a bit of humor, but even my imagination couldn't keep up with how close his real behavior already was to parody. He wasn't a mechanic showing up out of generosity. He was acting out a superhero fantasy, and Dana was his audience of one. The harder reality was that each detail accumulated into something that didn't sit right. The scripted words, the perfect timing, the rehearsed gestures, and now the knowledge that even Brenda saw a problem. Taken together, it started looking less like random good fortune and more like a system he controlled from behind the curtain. I felt jammed between suspicion and proof, caught in a play where the story hadn't revealed its ending yet. That itch for clarity only grew sharper the longer it went on. His rescues stopped surprising me. Instead, they set me on edge. Every time Dana's car so much as rattled, I knew I'd soon see Thomas playing out his well-rehearsed drama yet again. I couldn't turn off the thought that there had to be something deliberate about his precision, theatrical habits that no normal mechanic would ever feel the need to perform. I needed some way to untangle my suspicions from what might just be jealousy. I needed a record, some way to test whether I was inventing things in my head or whether Thomas's rescues were actually orchestrated. Watching his act and swallowing my frustration wasn't enough anymore. So I decided on something simple, something only I would see, at least at first. I started documenting. Nothing complicated, just a cheap spiral notebook I kept in my bag. Dates, times, when part failed, how fast Thomas arrived, and the exact way he carried himself each time. At first, it was supposed to be proof for myself, validation that I wasn't imagining the rhythm. But those pages quickly grew into something more, taking on the look of an investigation. And once I started, I couldn't stop. The boyfriend's detective notebook. I didn't wake up one morning deciding to play detective, but the idea settled, then almost on its own. After watching the cycle repeat more times than I could ignore, I grabbed an old spiral notebook from the drawer and started treating it as my case file. It wasn't fancy, just a couple bent pages left over from college notes, but once I wrote Incident 1 across the top, I couldn't stop. Each breakdown earned its own entry, date, time, exact location, and how long it took before Thomas appeared. I wasn't jotting guesses, I was building a record, one neat line at a time. The entries started plain enough. Friday, 2:05 p.m., Dana's battery dead. Thomas arrives 3 minutes later. Then came another Friday, 1:58 p.m., brakes acting up. Thomas on scene before roadside service even picked up. The quickness of his arrivals kept jumping off the page. With every new note, I could see the pattern layering itself into black and white proof, something harder to dismiss than a nagging gut feeling. Of course, I couldn't resist adding a little flair. A couple of pages in, the notebook wasn't just bullet points anymore. It had doodles spreading into the margins. One page held a rough sketch of Thomas's tow truck with the caption, "Base of Operations." Another page had him drawn in a cape, holding a wrench like a sword. My handwriting wasn't great, but the humor kept me steady. On one quiet night, I gave a full page to Operation Engine Timer scrawled in thick ink with arrows pointing to imaginary countdowns. Even though I knew that part was just me venting, the notebook still showed what mattered most, his uncanny timing. Sometimes I'd spread the pages across the dining table, flipping between entries like I was piecing together a crime novel. While Dana brushed it off and called it my weird little project, I took the notebook seriously. Every line was a marker, proof that the breakdowns weren't random streaks of bad luck. The consistency jumped out without needing colored string or thumbtacks. The data had its own rhythm, and I felt it pressing closer to one conclusion. Thomas had knowledge no one else did. Carrying the notebook with me turned into habit, like carrying a wallet. If Dana texted suddenly about car trouble, I didn't just react. I reached for the spiral first. Even at work, I'd flip it open and add quick details the second she called. I didn't tell anyone what I was tracking. I didn't need side eyes or explanations about why I had pages full of times and locations that made it look like I was shadowing a sitcom character instead of living a relationship. The funny thing was how the notebook shaped my focus. While Dana's words were about inconvenience, canceled plans, waiting around, or having to reschedule her day, I absorbed events as evidence. Each time she sighed in the passenger seat about another wasted afternoon, I was busy noting the exact intersection, cross street, and minute Thomas rolled up. Where she saw inconvenience, I saw patterns. Where she saw someone saving her, I saw timing too perfect to ignore. Even the humor in my scribbles echoed what bothered me most. The cape sketches, or hero pose predictions, weren't wild theories. They were shorthand reminders, making me smile long enough to mask annoyance. But they always circled back to the same line of evidence. The breakdowns happened on schedule, and Thomas arrived prepared. That wasn't me imagining elaborate devices or Bond-level sabotage. That was me cataloging dates and noticing how the dots kept connecting only to him. Looking at it now, the notebook was both funny and serious. Funny in how it resembled a comic book script at times, with goofy sketches poking fun at Thomas's flair. Serious, because for the first time, I had a record I could point to instead of just my voice. When I flipped through it from start to finish, it felt undeniable. The numbers spoke clearly. It wasn't paranoia if the pattern stared back at me in ink. But pages and dates only took me so far. The notebook pinned down the rhythm, yes, but it was still just theory written on paper. What I needed next was something physical, something I could see, touch, or point at beyond the spiral. Because no matter how neat the dates were lined up, Dana didn't feel the weight of them. She shrugged off my suspicions even with the notebook sitting between us. And that's when the story tipped forward. All the notes, all the scratches in the margins, every Cape Doodle and sarcastic label, they built enough resolve in me to start paying close attention beyond the page. That's what pushed me towards spotting the first tangible clue, the moment where suspicion shifted into evidence. What struck me most, though, was how Dana remained oblivious through all of this. While I logged patterns and timing in my so-called case file, she floated along in a completely different story. And it wasn't mine. For every date I circled and every second I measured, she reacted like she was stepping into a romantic comedy instead of a repeating trap. Girlfriend's blissful oblivion. Dana, on the other hand, never seemed to notice a thing. Every time the hood popped open and Thomas slid in to save the day, her whole face softened into gratitude, like watching a scene play out the way it was supposed to. It didn't matter if it was the third breakdown that month, she treated each one like a fresh rescue, thanking him over and over as if he were doing the impossible. What I saw as constant interference, she received as a kind of gift. One night, when the car died again and Thomas rolled up faster than roadside assistance ever could, Dana actually called him her guardian angel. She said it in this light, joking voice, but the way she looked at him afterwards gave it weight. I made a joke under my breath, something bitter, something about demons and wrenches, but it slid right past her. What stuck with her was the nickname, and she repeated it later at dinner, proud of how perfectly it fit. I can still remember sitting across from her, smiling politely while my insides twisted up, because I'd been the one she leaned on before. Now, that role was clearly shifting. The gratitude never paused, no matter how disruptive the timing got. Once her brakes failed, just as she needed to leave for an important family dinner, and Thomas jumped in without hesitation. She was so relieved she texted me later about how amazing it was that he knew just what to do right when she needed it most. Another time, her car wouldn't start in a parking lot when she had to get to work, and Thomas rescued her before she even had the chance to call me. She was thankful, glowing about how dependable he was, while my offers to step in barely registered. It was that shift, the quiet but constant redirection toward him, that hit hardest. She used to call me first, even for simple inconveniences, like when she locked her keys inside the house or needed advice about where to take her car. But lately, she didn't. She reached out to Thomas, smiled at Thomas, praised Thomas. The more she leaned into his help, the less she seemed to notice mine. I didn't need to hear her say it outright. The steady beam in her eyes whenever she looked at him during a breakdown told me all I needed to know. In her story, Thomas was the one positioned at the center while I stuck to the edges. When I tried voicing my concern, she waved it aside as if I were imagining problems that weren't there. Thomas is just always around, she said once, shrugging like it was some fixed law of nature. She wasn't dismissive out of malice. She genuinely didn't see anything strange about the pattern. To her, a friend being that available was lucky, not suspicious. My words, my notes, my unease, all of it sounded petty stacked against her steady gratitude. Watching her choose to trust in him so fully made my doubts sound smaller every time I spoke them out loud. And that silence from her end, her gentle brush off, hurt more than I wanted to admit. I often caught myself studying her more than the repairs. The way she sighed with relief when Thomas tightened the last bolt, or how she'd lean against the car sipping coffee while he worked, completely calm and confident. It was ordinary for her. The steadiness of her gratitude had its own logic, and I started to resent how cleanly it erased my suspicions. I could mutter under my breath, scribble in my notebook, connect the dots until midnight, but none of it weighed as much to Dana as a single reassuring smile from Thomas. The maddening part was how much sense it seemed to make from her perspective. Breakdowns are stressful, and someone who always fixes them for free has obvious value. She had no reason to dig deeper. In her story, she had a trusted friend who swooped in whenever needed, and that was the end of it. But watching it happen through my eyes made the whole thing unbearable. I could feel myself fading into the background while she poured trust into him. Gratitude built a wall I couldn't climb, no matter how many suspicions or notes I threw at it. That split between our views felt like living in separate realities. To her, the plot was simple. She had someone dependable she could count on, someone she even teased about being her guardian angel. To me, each breakdown was a staged scene building towards something larger. I couldn't shake the sense that his rehearsed timing and free repairs weren't acts of kindness, they were part of the trick. And no matter how many times I tried to explain, I sounded jealous, petty, or over-analytical. That, more than anything, deepened the distance between us. It finally hit me during one of those late-night rescues when she said, "I don't know what I'd do without him." She said it casually, almost as an afterthought, but it landed heavier than anything else. Because I remembered when she used to say things like that about me, when I was the person she called first, the one she leaned on without thinking. Now, every time her car stalled, she didn't even dial my number. She expected him. And that unshakable certainty she had around Thomas only sharpened the frustration I carried in silence. Looking back, her oblivion is what made the whole setup sting so sharply. If she had seen through the surface even once, if she had questioned his timing or raised the same doubts I held, it might have closed the gap I felt tearing open between us. But her steady gratitude kept the illusion alive. Every smile she sent his way was another reminder that my warnings weren't breaking through. And as much as I hated it, I couldn't deny that her certainty made me look wild in comparison. I didn't stop observing, though, and I didn't stop recording. If anything, her unwavering faith pushed me further into watching carefully, because while she believed she was witnessing simple kindness, I believed I was watching something staged. And the longer it went on, the clearer it became that Thomas wasn't just repairing cars, he was putting on a show. That realization is what stuck with me most. It wasn't just about the bolts or the smoke under the hood anymore. His rescues had an audience, and in every scene, Dana was caught up in his performance. What I noticed next shifted everything, making it impossible to pretend these were simple fixes. The theater of repairs. The first glimpse of what I'd later call the theater of repairs happened right in Dana's driveway. Thomas had the hood lifted, and instead of bending down quietly to actually handle the problem, he let out these deep, dramatic sighs that seemed rehearsed. They weren't ordinary mechanic noises. They were staged, the kind of sighs you'd expect from an actor playing a weary hero. Then came the voice, heavy, deliberate, laced with ominous phrasing about catastrophic failure and seconds away from disaster. Dana leaned on the fender, wide-eyed, taking in every exaggerated word like they were gospel, while I stood a few steps back, thinking it was just a blown fuse. What should have been a 5-minute diagnosis turned into a full script. Thomas narrating as though he wasn't tightening bolts, but fighting off the apocalypse with a wrench. From that moment on, I noticed the motif repeating itself with every so-called emergency. His two trademark moves became easy to spot, almost like catchphrases in a sitcom. First came the long, world-weary sigh, a vocal cue that danger had barely been avoided. He squeezed it into every scene, whether it was a squeaky belt or a nearly flat tire. Then came the reveal, pulling some harmless part from under the hood with grave ceremony. It could be a bolt, a smudged filter, a piece of tubing, but the way he raised it up like sacred evidence, you'd swear he had yanked out the car's beating heart. Each time, Dana gasped on cue, staring at the object in his greasy hands like he had just discovered the one thing standing between her and a fiery highway death. Watching it roll out again and again, I realized these weren't habits, they were props. The sigh, the held-up part, the speech about unseen dangers, they kept the audience, Dana, hooked every single time. And that was the real performance. She didn't just drive away believing the car was fixed. She drove away believing she had narrowly survived something. The fact Thomas repeated the same moves each time only seemed to make them land harder with her. I started to think of them as his stage cues, the signals he always hit before the curtain could fall. What unsettled me more was when I caught him continuing the act even after Dana left the scene. One particular evening stands out. Dana had gone back inside, thanking him yet again for saving her from what he had called a certain blowout waiting to happen. But I hung back on the porch. After she disappeared inside, I saw Thomas quietly raise the car again on the jack and crawl underneath. No audience this time, no dramatic sighs, no show. Just quiet tinkering he hadn't bothered to attempt when she was standing there. That was the moment that clicked something deeper for me. The routine wasn't about repairs at all when she was present. The real adjustments, whatever they were, happened afterwards, when he wasn't performing. The thought gnawed at me. Was he fixing what he'd staged earlier? Creating the next emergency? Or just cleaning up the mess left from the scene he'd acted out? I couldn't tell, but the separation between showtime and the hidden second act told me one thing clearly. His behavior wasn't about efficient maintenance. It was about keeping Dana convinced. The car problems weren't random inconveniences. They had a rhythm, a storyline, and he was the writer, director, and star. The longer it went on, the harder it became for me to even take the repairs seriously. Whenever Thomas crouched down and sighed into the engine bay, I heard the same cadence actors use on stage.